Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in February 2023, and we're going to be talking about AWS Security Hub, and I would say AWS Security. And it's going to be a panel, it's going to be quite interactive. And again, we want to do lots of similar sessions in the future about AWS and get the practitioners, which we got here, to collaborate and share insights. So so I'm Dinis. I help to organize a lot of stuff. I do have quite a lot of experience in AWS. When I was a more hands-on CTO, I did a lot of coding on top of AWS. I led teams that were building all sorts of really powerful AWS solutions. So I have quite, I would say, inside knowledge of what works, what doesn't work. Maybe André, quick one, intro to you and your AWS world.
Very little experience with it. In fairness, it was only in the last role that I actually got to play with it. So I'm actually keen to learn from what you guys have experienced.
Cool. Ayse?
Hi, my name is Ayse. I'm a senior cloud security engineer at justeattakeaway.com now, and I've been there for 1.5 years. So for the past, I would say 2.5 to 3 years, I've got AWS experience from using AWS resources and services, etc., all the way to securing them. And I use Security Hub in the past as well.
Cool. Rakesh?
Hi, I've recently joined at Comcast, major internet service provider in US and UK over there. So my work nature is mostly into software assessment applications, but when you ask me my cloud experience, I'm not that much intermediate level and advanced level, but I love to explore cloud and would love to know more about AWS. So that's the main reason why I've agreed to be part of this panel. At least where I can able to learn something at the end of the day with discussions over the people over here. So
Cool.
happy to be part of the discussion.
Cool. So let's start with kind of what we know as a group, right? So I guess the interesting question is, if you join an organization that's been using AWS for a while or is power user of AWS, and what are I would say the top 5 kind of AWS security features, AWS security tools that you've used that you would recommend?
I can kick that one off. So the security groups was something that I actually saw that it wasn't fully used to the extent that it can bring value. And in that regard, I actually saw development teams, what they were doing was, because they were releasing often, considering that that was not actually a requirement, which in the beginning I got a bit like, why are they doing that? But when you have, or you lack some maturity on development teams that actually just, publish a lot, they think that that's actually quite okay because things keep on changing all the time. So you're like creating your new virtual machines, the environment keeps on changing so that the threats just go away. And just having security groups on what is the possibilities of what you can do and not, that would be one of the advantages. And it's, I think, a very simple one.
Cool. All right.
Mm-hmm.
You guys want to chip in with the other ones you really like?
There are too many. I would definitely start with not looking into security services. Definitely, first place I would go, how are we doing with IAM? What are we doing in the IAM world? Do we have permissions, restrictive enough, or do we have permission boundaries? Are we using roles enough and stuff like that? So that's usually where I would start, because I think access has become more and more important with move to cloud. Access is the most important, I think.
Yeah.
You can cover up any holes you want within, if access is not tackled. The exploit is just unimaginable, and the ocean is yours basically.
Yeah.
So that's where I would start for sure. But in terms of favorite as an engineer, I would say I played around with config a lot. That comes along with Security Hub anyway. And also Access Analyzer. Access Analyzer is brilliant because it's not only free, but also if you leverage it well, it can really help with what I just said about IAM.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely Security Hub would be within the list for sure.
Can you expand on AWS config? Because that's actually something that I think some teams miss, right? But it's insanely powerful, right? Because it allows it to start applying whole sets of standards, right, for how things are created, right, and to deploy things at quite a nice scale and to capture things before they become a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, so AWS Security Hub is brilliant because it's a centralized place, one-stop shop for your security service to be able to go in, etc. But the biggest value, as the service came out and so far has been provided, has been it's leveraging another service called AWS Config. So Config has mostly AWS managed configuration rules you can apply within your AWS accounts that will tell you, depending on whatever the config rule is looking out for, whether resources are compliant or not compliant. So what Security Hub does is, utilizing this service, has a set of standardized config rules, for example, CIS being one, PCI DSS being one. When you enable these standard packs, then config goes and finds the non-compliant resources and then brings it to Security Hub for you to view. And the great feature is that you can view that now across all regions within one console.
Yeah, and things like enforcing, for example, policies for EC2 instances that start up, enforcing policies for exposed S3 buckets, enforcing policies for API gateways and all sorts of things, right? It allows you to do that. It's actually really cool, right? Because I've seen in the past where we were using that to make sure, for example, no EC2 instance could be exposed to, could start up that didn't have, for example, that had ports open, right? It's like, okay, we won't allow anything apart from these ports to be open on that particular group, right? Yeah, so you're right, AWS config, it's an insane, when used right, it can be super powerful.
The good part with it is that managed rules that cover a whole lot of things that you want to look for security anyways. Like you said, for example, you can look at security groups that have open ports like SSH from the entire world, and you don't want that to be attached to an EC2 instance that's in public subnet, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you can find out those resources very quickly. And the one thing to sort of keep in mind with config is it is possible to write your own custom policies as well, but it uses God, and I found it a bit complex to just work with, to be honest, so far. And I've always found other ways like cloud custodian policies, etc. instead.
Yeah.
So I found that a bit easier to deal with. But if you're a small to medium to sort of large, even depending on your budget, I guess, and you want to get started with secure configuration within AWS for services and resources, config is the best place to start, because the packs are easy to turn on, and if service is regional, then you can immediately get results and see stuff, and you can attach auto remediations to them. So for example, in the case of S3 bucket, for example, the config rule will look out for any S3 bucket with a public bucket policy that makes the S3 bucket public. What you can do is you can put in an auto remediation to the config that will say, hey, look out for any S3 buckets that are public, and then remove the public access from the bucket policy. So there's really cool remediations that you can do in automatic.
Sorry to stop you. So will it be by default there is an option to check whether the buckets are public, or you need to do the configuration of it?
So the managed config rule is available that you can configure off the console CLI or even API. Yeah, and you can do it just for that configuration, or you can do it as part of a pack, which probably falls under all standards like CIS or PCI, or AWS has its own minimum security requirements sort of standard as well. So it sort of falls under that too.
Good to know, because when conducting penetration testing particularly for S3 bucket misconfiguration, we do use different sort of tools to identify. Never know that AWS config has a different rule set kind of thing, where we can able to find the public buckets. It's a good thing actually.
Yeah, I think I had seen like audit or, pen testing, etc. practices utilizing what's called like AWS Audit Manager. And that's another service that utilizes config in the background as well. So Security Hub, Audit Manager, these are all using config as a service in the background. And you can just go and enable the config yourself rather than using these added services. If it's just a, one-time check that you want to do, point in time.
The power of the config is that it's working in real time. So it's not a one moment in time. Is that, if something happens, if somebody gets enabled, or even an attacker, right? You can even sometimes pick up attacks, but most likely will be a team that makes a mistake or has a very legit use for some cases, but it overexposes it. So it also allows to give teams reasonable amount of power so they can get on with their job, but almost say, look, you need these permissions to do your job, but if you make a mistake or if you don't fully understand that particular change has these side effects, then it kicks in and then it enforces the rule in there.
It's brilliant, but it does come with a bit of a I would say cost warning, because the cost can really go up if you enable config rules for all accounts, everything you can think of, all managed config rules, and you enable all at once, even if the ones that you're not using or monitoring. There are many ways of doing it, obviously. Config is not the only way. So what you can do, if you want to see a change, a configuration change in real time, what you can also do, leverage AWS's Event Bridge, which used to be part of CloudWatch, Event Bridge event rules to identify the config change as it happens, and then you can have your function to carry out the API to remediate that change as well, using lambdas. So that's another way of looking at remediation or looking after your configuration changes. But config definitely gives you that sort of very convenient, easy to turn on, easy to pull findings and metrics aspect as well. So it really depends on how much customized do you want it to be. You can definitely go serverless way and find out configuration. Secure configuration management is, I must say, really tough. If the scale is large and there are a lot of AWS environments and accounts that we're talking about, it is quite tough. And if we're looking at different environments as well, you want to be flexible on sandbox accounts, for example. You want to be more restrictive on other environments, and it is definitely challenging. Config makes it easy from the perspective of, hey, find the easy wins for me.
Zach had a good question. Zach, are you able to ask the question?
Yes, I had a couple of thoughts as well. When we talk about config, then I found it really useful in the past to use the resource timeline as well. So when managing an environment and someone's made a change, for example, like you said, opening up a security group, just going in and having a look at the resource timeline and seeing who's made that change and what the configuration was before. And the advanced queries as well, I found that quite useful as well in the past, just to list what resources we've got or which running instances we've got, for example. My question was, have you used SHA, so the Security Hub Automated Response Remediation? Because I know you did touch on the auto remediation a little bit, and I did use SHA in the past. I think initially the first version of it would give you the option for auto remediations, and then they changed it so you would have to actually go into Security Hub and click the remediate button on the failing. So I was just wondering if anyone else is utilised that and what the thoughts were.
I don't think I'm familiar with what you're referring to. Sorry, what did you say? The automated Security Hub actions?
It's Security Hub Automated Response and Remediation. So it's something that AWS have developed themselves, and it's a cloud formation stack that you can deploy in your organizational account, which produces a bunch of resources. But there's a blog post on it online, I think.
Yeah, okay, now I understand which one you're referring to. I've never implemented it as it comes, to be honest, because the environments where I worked previously always had their own custom needs. So I would be really skeptical on bringing a custom, auto remediation as set out by the like that. But I had done it like separately, use case by use case before.
Sure.
So yes, there were times when I had to implement manually triggered auto remediations, which you can do within Security Hub, or you can do within whatever the service is using separately. But if I was using config, auto remediation was definitely something that I used for S3 pub, for example. There were many cases when you can block this on an account level, so you don't really have to remediate anything. So it really depends on that use case. So I wouldn't really, I know AWS samples are amazing, and they maintain it, they contribute to it, etc. But I don't know any organization would be completely ready, unless they are ground up just building the cloud environments now, would be comfortable with bringing auto remediations like without without a review, basically. So I would also recommend looking into service control policies where there is definitely something preventative you can put in place. And you don't really need to leverage, allowing the change first and then auto-remediating. You can put in what's called service control policies that comes under AWS organizations to deny the action altogether in the first place. And sorry, I'm like talking about other AWS services here and not Security Hub per se.
No,
but
to be honest, I think just think about AWS security, right? Hub is just one, and like you already several times, Hub is just a nice way of AWS to package some of the stuff that happens underneath, right? But the real action is on some of those, right? And actually touching on the point, of identity access management, the reality is that a lot of these things should be preventable by really good understanding of the identity access management, because that's where and I sometimes try to, especially when something happens, I try to look at the root cause of it. So if you look at it, why do we had this incident, or why do we had this alert, why did this just happen? It's like, probably we're in a situation where the developer should not even be able to do some of those things, right? Or the architects. And also, I think more and more, you want to start thinking about moving some stuff to code, right? So I think one of the best practices, it starts to be, again, to spinning up resources, to spinning up stuff. It's like, really, the less you click on the AWS environment, the better, at least for production, right? Okay, if you're experimenting, if you're learning stuff, but it's almost like you should be banning clicking, right, on things, because that creates an environment where it's not replicable, right? So again, when you create new services, the best place to really put good security and really good practices is on that pipeline where you say, I need X, I need buckets, and that's where you can almost make sure that there isn't the functionality, there isn't the capability, or you like, for example, like you should not have a capability to create a public S3 bucket, right? And if you do, it should be on very specific pipelines or very specific, tangents that for that to occur.
I completely agree. I think insecure configuration can definitely be caught before it gets to the API, AWS's API level. If you're pipelining everything, you can catch them within the IAC. You can even, prevent it from, making engineers or developers aware that they shouldn't be doing it in the first place, all the way to, failing the build within the pipeline because it has that insecure configuration within it, depending on how risky the environment is. You could definitely do things like that before it gets to AWS. The less interaction there is with the console, the less interaction it means that users and developers are using their own principal roles to carry out the action. So even within the IAM level, then you can restrict on the console level and only get the pipeline role to do what you want it to do. So there's definitely that, but because it really depends on organizational needs, what they currently have. Were they native to begin with? Did they migrate afterwards? Were they legacy, and now they're still carrying on that legacy stuff and things like that. So when you look at Security Hub, I think if you want to be mindful of cost and use and catching it in time, it may not always be the right answer, because if you consider Security Hub, it's sort of like a CSPM, right? It is a cloud security posture management tool that catches it within the environment. So whatever you want, you would want a third-party CSPM to do, think of Security Hub from and utilize config that way. One thing that was really, really cool, and they've carried on doing, is they're bringing in they're allowing you to bring in results from open source tools that you might be utilizing within AWS. So for example, I had done it with there's an open source tool called Kubebench. So I ran Kubebench and had my findings, and then I managed to get my findings to be sent to Security Hub. So without that config aside, Security Hub still has a lot of use cases for that, centralization. It's very cool. The filtering, I don't think is very good, and there are many things that I can talk about it that's really, really not good. And being able to export stuff, for example, for metrics purposes, is really not good. In terms of percentages it gives you for your posture management, so how are you doing within CIS world, and it tells you how that's calculated. So all of that, there's like some maturity to do from Security Hub perspective. But like I said, if you're on the beginning of a journey for security for AWS and a fairly medium company, I would say would be a perfect place to start.
Rakesh, any comments from your side?
Yeah, whatever Ayse speaking on us, like two more things to be add. One good thing is you can do the automatic security checks against whatever the standards over there, and you can able to remediate the findings as well. So obviously, when you're trying to put it in enterprise level, so these things should be taken care of, because being in a very good level of organization with a number of clouds, so you need to take care of the security also. And if we are deploying something in public S3 bucket, that should not be any sensitive information. In that case, you can deploy it in public. So we need to be taken care of that thing as well.
Yeah.
And one more point, like when we talk about one particular service in AWS, we have to obviously pull in another service. So that's how we are getting the benefits of AWS, if you ask me. So we are using IAM and guard duty. So everything is connected, as I told, like all the main purpose is to config each and everything with integrating with.
Yeah. What about you, Zach? What's your kind of, if you were started new in an environment that was doing a lot of AWS, but didn't have a lot of the security tooling and kind of practices, what will you do? What will be your top 5, hit the ground running, get lots of value from a security point of view from AWS?
I think doing the basics, like if it was a big organization, make sure you've got CloudTrail, organizational trail deployed. We mentioned before the SCPs, so I know you can get some good out of the box SCPs, but one that I always like to start with is preventing users from creating IAM console users. I think that's always a great one. What else? You really put me on the spot there. It's difficult. I always have these ideas in my head, but when trying to think about them, I guess the one thing that I like as well is like trying to get the alerting ready for Security Hub as well. So once you've got Security Hub enabled and you've got your AWS foundational best practices and your CIS, etc., having alerting set up. So if you have something gone from a compliant status to a non-compliant status, having an SSS fire that an email out to whoever needs to see that, I think that's pretty good. Guard duty as well. I know that it can create quite a lot of noise, but it's always pretty good to have guard duty enabled. I think you can have that plugged into Security Hub as well. You can have Inspector plugged in, that sort of stuff.
And guard duty will pick up also weird stuff that's happening, right? Weird activities, weird connections and things, and that you go, oh, how is that even possible, right? Like how,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's what I think it's a good trick to try to use those events as early warnings and to almost try to, again, sometimes you need to build a body of evidence and say, look, the reason why we're worried about this is because this is happening, right? And also treat those, sometimes you got lucky because it wasn't a real, focus attack, or, that in that particular case, the asset was not important, or they didn't, the attackers didn't succeed, but to use those examples, a lot more effectively, right? And then learn from it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to get stuck down a rabbit hole once you're seeing alerting gadgets.
Yeah, of course, right?
Yeah. Another one that I always like to use is obviously utilize Control Tower and organizations, and also AWS SSO, which I think is Identity and Access Management Center now. I really like the way that you can use permission sets and get really granular with that. I think that's really handy to be able to use. So yeah, there are a few things I always like to start off with.
Well, an interesting one that I sometimes, and some companies have different philosophy on this, but I'm a big fan of lots of AWS organizations, because in a way sometimes you cannot prevent certain things from happening, or even over privileging, and then you go, well, in a way, it's kind of like, well, they already have a lot of power, right? How do you again lock things down? So it's almost like if you start to have different organizations, you can really start to have even good governance on your crown jewels, or the things that are really important, and then start to split between maybe the more experimental teams and the more legacy teams, and the more enterprise sort of platform teams, and they then because each will have different standards, right? And then you kind of want to almost enforce, like you would argue that these days a solid platform team should not log into console, right? Like they shouldn't. Everything should be as code, right? Changes, even new accounts, new stuff, new provisions, new things should all be done as code. But that might not be possible for other teams, right? And then I think that's it's not necessarily a security feature, but I think has a lot of advantages, right, in doing it like that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think another thing which I find really, really good is, like, in space of looking at some of the failings, some you can get some, like, you can start cherry picking, some that might not even be, that you don't even need to lock down, but it's nice to get that score up. And I think it's really useful to use CloudFormation stack sets to deploy stuff to your whole organization. For example, IAM password policies. If console users, it's really good just to create that stack set, deploy it out, and then your score's just gone up. I think that's really, really good.
Absolutely. Yeah, because identity access management, right? It's still the single, way that you can shoot yourself in the foot, right? And there's some really cool tools out there already that also try to, again, give you visibility and context. I feel that there's now a new market that is emerging of technologies that and third-party products, which eventually, will be rolled into AWS. But it's almost like products that are, and services that are trying to connect the dots, right? Trying to give you context. Because in security, I think sometimes the challenge is that without context, A, we might be looking at the wrong thing. B, the developers or the engineers, they have some context. So we completely lose credibility to say, look, you should fix this. And they go, but why? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because, it's the whole thing, people go, oh, you have to patch that image, or that's completely exposed. So, yeah, but it's on a subnet that is close to the outside world. So yeah. Fine, but you should be worried about this one here, right? We might not look as sexy, but actually it is exposed and it's being rammed, right? And it could be a massive problem. So hey, having that context and having that graph, right, I think is super critical.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you.
So cool. So one of the features that I think it'd be interesting to talk about, right, is the whole ability to, I think, consume and drive automation. So for example, like you talk about, doing stuff in an automatic way. I always find that it's an evolution, right? And again, to add a comment, right, is that you need to almost have visibility and understand the side effects, because, if you don't, when stuff goes wrong, or, stuff happens automatically, you could actually cause more problems. And I find that there's a nice path that arrives at full automation if you start to, almost go on that way of understanding action, visibility, understand the side effects, bit of automation, almost like the observability of what you do is so critical, because A, make sure that you're doing the right thing. B, it gives you more and more confidence to automate more and more and more.
I completely agree. I think it's definitely you grow from first visibility. What's happening within my environment? Let me monitor, and that Security Hub really helps with that to begin with. You know, let's see the monitoring side of it. Let's see what's been happening. Are there insecure configurations that already exist? How am I going to tackle that? And by that, that allows you the opportunity to learn your environment. How do your developers and engineers work? What are the needs and requirements of certain environments? And that's when that information is really critical when you're making a decision of whether to go auto remediation or not. Because when you go auto remediation, which is like that next step of evolution, like you said, Dinis, is you need to be really aware of what you're blocking. And are there alternatives, whatever you're blocking, that people, when in need, can use? And that could be emergency access. It could be being able to maybe spin up an instance that is within the public subnet and that may have things open, depending on whatever that use case is. So what is your emergency plan when you put in that auto remediation? How can you roll back specifically? And that's really important as well. That is usually most of the time the pushback is when security engineers decide to go auto remediation is that the unknown, in case we need, what's going to happen. So you've got to sort of like work with the engineers at times to come up with that plan as well. And it also requires understanding of engineering practices as well. So not everyone has that sort of culture,
but that's the key, right? That's you cannot separate those, right? Like I feel that having the ability to automate things doesn't, actually André keeps raising sometimes that point that if you sometimes give tools that are too powerful to some individuals, right, they sometimes can end up making even bigger mistakes because they're not understanding the side effects you're doing, right? And I always think that if somebody's going to just run something because it says so on the tin, right, and without really understanding, you already have bigger problems, right? And those individuals will probably also going to create tons of other problems. A lot of these techniques are, yes, AWS keeps doing a good job at, on the worldly maps world, productizing, moving to the right, improving things, and eventually reach a level of maturity. But, I think for a lot of, the practitioners, we need to really understand. I think you need to be technical, right? Like you cannot do AWS security without really understanding what happens under the hood, right? And I think, or else you're going to cause even bigger problems, right? And sometimes we overstep that a little bit. It's like, look, you do need to be technical, right? Because if you're not, you don't really understand the side effects, right?
If
and you can cause bigger problems.
If anything, you need to know AWS services, resources, features better than the engineers themselves, because they usually, engineers and developers have a focus area that they may only need to relate to certain services, whereas a security engineer would need to have that knowledge to be able to understand what the service does and how can that service and its configuration be exploited during an attack. Or accidental, whatever you're trying to, because at the end of the day, we're also supporting not just security, but resilience too, whichever way you look at these configurations.
Absolutely. I used to get in trouble when I said people need to know how to develop and be very technical on these things, but I completely agree with you, right? Because I think it is also a case of, ultimately a lot of these things have to be implemented by developers, right? By the DevOps teams, right? Like, in fact, the last thing a security professional should be doing is touching production, right? Like, again, you touch it, you own it, right? Like, but on the other hand, you need to be really good and have hands-on experience to know what's possible versus what's not possible.
I've got a good example of what can go wrong in that sort of scenario. So we had an engineer who set a tagging policy, I think through organizations for EC2 instances, deployed that across the organization, and then stuff started going down, production instances started going down. It was basically, some developers hadn't updated the tags in their IAC. So when instances were getting spun down, they can't spin them back up because they've not got the correct tags, So it's like, say, about having that domain knowledge in the, the knowledge of different resources. It's really important.
that's a lovely segue to I think one of the biggest security tools that AWS has that tends to be way overlooked is the AWS costs and the billing data. The billing data is one of the best data that you can get for what actually is happening in your organization. Better than CloudTrail, better than any other thing. The only annoying thing, and they might have changed, if not, let me publicly shame AWS here, right? Last time I looked, it was not even close to real time. It was a 6-hour lag to 12 hours between billing data, which I just say I think is irresponsible, because there's lots of things that you can only pick up with billing data, including when the business shoots himself on the foot, right? And suddenly have something going out of control, right? Which I had once, right? I had a Lambdas running out of control. Sometimes too much automation goes out of control, and I had these Lambdas firing up 1,000 concurrently for a couple of hours, right? Which, again, it was an attack, right? Okay, I caused it, right? But it was an attack because, it was, a resource that went out of control, right? But what's your views on using billing data as another set of really good security visibility, right? To what's going on?
I'm actually really surprised you said that, because I don't think I've heard anyone else talk about this, because the amount of times I use bills to check everything but cost is just unbelievable.
Yeah,
I don't think I have had this conversation with anyone else in the industry.
Oh, you're not the only one, because I heard it's from several people from AWS, right? So, but you're not the only one.
Definitely, especially if you're dealing with like really large org. Okay, so you want to I've seen a whole lot of posts on Stack Overflow, people asking each other, giving answers, and a whole lot of reading I had to do, which I think I could have just chucked onto, ChatGPT or something if I had to do it. Basically, everyone was talking about, how am I going to get a list of regions that I'm using? What if there are regions that I'm using that I don't know, that there are services and resources that's being utilized, and what am I going to do? So if you look at it from that perspective, most of the time in organizations, engineers and developers don't have that billing permission. They won't be able to see that. But billing provides account by account which regions, which services use which regions, perfectly. So like, this is just one of the examples where I just found it's really, really cool. If you have the means and budget, and you have some tools like, I don't know, there is Cloud Health from, I think, VMware, and there's Cloudability from another company. Yes, you can collect data and you can see a lot more with them, but just on its own, there is a lot to be discovered within billing, for sure.
I've done exactly the same. We was trying to lock down regional usage, and I did the exact same. Let's discover what's actually in regions that we don't usually operate in, and we found all sorts. And and it was from like back when we first implemented AWS, and people were starting instances like test instances, and not selecting the right region because they just don't have a clue about regions yet. And it's instances that have been running for years. And like we say, like tagging and stuff like that, it's good to see what I'm sure tagging is part of. You can
monitor by tagging.
Absolutely. Yeah. So found it useful for that as well.
Yeah, the only thing I said, like, it really annoyed me was the fact that there was things that I wish we had more insight, and we were like running. It's between 12 and 6 hours behind, right? It depends on the updates, right? And it was because I got to the point where I was actually pumping a lot of that data into Elastic. So I do a lot of automation, right? And it was really cool because I could clean it up, right? And I can connect a lot of the dots. And again, the billing data was so awesome, right? To really understand what's going on.
And a lot of instances from Zach, got to know from one of my friend. He left this EC2 instance on with this credit card bill. We have AWS free tier, for 12 months. So he forgot that it's going to be renewed, but he left his EC2 instance on. Thank God the limit was less, but then he able to figure out, okay, the bill once generated, he got to know. But one bad thing is, like, we can't able to justify with the AWS people that we have not used that particular instance. We actually forgot to close it. So they won't get convinced for any chance. We have to pay the bill, of course, right?
Yeah, sometimes, but yeah, every now and then you can argue, right? With it. All right, go on, you co-host, man. You chip in. Come on. Share your screen if you can. Like, you're supposed to be on a panel.
Sorry guys, I got a bit late to come to this, but this discussion about cost control and all that.
Can you share? Sorry, can you share your camera just so I can bring you? To
Bear with me. My background, I'm not sure if I've set it up
correctly.
There you go.
There you go. You look like in the beach.
Sorry, it's been cold and I've been, So basically, I just want to talk briefly about cost control because there's a tool that I used before, which is called M0, and I just shared that link. Basically, it allows you to be able to do governance and cost control, so you know who deploys what. This complements your DevOps team in terms of what provisioning they're doing on the cloud. And one of the good thing about this is it allows you to actually assign time period for deploying any resource. So you can decide and say, well, okay, if this is being used for POC, I'm not going to go beyond this cost. And that way, you can run that to complement your billing. But more importantly, it gives you a breakdown of who's deployed what. And I found that very useful at my previous place of work, because it was easy for us to see who is deploying what, and you can actually have a cap. And so, well, if you're running an instance, EC2 instance or whatever it is, I can decide that this is only going to be available for a few hours, and that's it. So whether you forget to shut it down or not, that's a governance that you can implement doing that. So it's what, maybe you guys having a look at that. And talking about security in general, I think for me, the key thing is always to understand what is the architecture of what anybody is doing, because most of the times I think security teams are always playing catch up, and that's because we do not have visibility of what the dev teams are doing. And as you rightly said, is it the lady Ayse? Okay, they find all these useful tools at any sites, and then they just try to use it. But if you have access to a lot of the logs and your monitoring stuff, you will be able to see what's going on behind the scene. But it's a tough ask, as Dinis will say. I mean, covering web application, APIs, mobile application, and maybe some other incidents, it's a tough job for teams to catch up with. Automation is the key. And the more automation we're able to do to remove the human error, the best chance we have at remediating or even fixing some of this. We use Lacework, which is almost complementary to Security Hub. And Lacework applies a lot of machine learning to a lot of the activity. So it basically imports CloudTrail. And then analyze that. So basically, if you've deployed maybe S3 buckets, or you're logging in from a particular, or making API calls to whatever workload you've got in the cloud, it starts giving you alerts. Now, so anything about governance in terms of tagging, all those sort of things, you get alerted, every now and then. So it's up to you to decide, well, is this noise or is this what I want? And what was it you told? The tool. Lacework. Let me see if I can. Sorry, I'm going to copy the. Let's see.
In fact, one of the coolest features he has, and he goes back actually to the topic.
It's called the polygraph. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yes. Talk about
so the polygraph. Right? Basically, sorry. Let me just get the URL. Lacework. Lacework. Where is the? Okay. I'm gonna share this. Okay, bear with me. Lacework. Type that in here. Okay. So Lacework. Now it's got something called polygraph, and that polygraph basically, gives you the visibility of all the connections of what's happening. So you got a resource in AWS, and you've got, well, let's say you've deployed an application in Kubernetes or whatever. If somebody is making a call to your application, it gives you the polygraph of what AWS or whatever account that call is coming from and the interaction. And basically, even if you don't understand how your application works, it actually draws how all the services integrate. And this is basically by deploying agents in your Kubernetes clusters and start having that visibility of everything. It draws all the clusters, to see, it shows you whether the calls are denied or whatever. So if you want to investigate who is having a lot of calls or DDoS attack on your endpoints, it draws those things to say, well, this is what you're getting. And basically it flags to say, well, I'm seeing these repeated things. Is this something normal? And if it's not, you can flag it and say, well, okay, investigate. Or I think there was a case, Dinis, where we got data team provisioning a lot of resources that had overprivileged permissions. And, so we went back to the team to say, guys, why are you provisioning this? And they're like, oh, I didn't know. I'm just provisioning stuff. And because you have those alerts that can easily, give you alerts of any threshold or any thing that anybody is doing, you're able to quickly respond, almost immediately.
Yeah.
But is this an agent or is this an API that you have to feed in with information?
No. So it depends. Yeah, well, it's an agent that you install in anywhere you want. So in your workload, you install an agent, and it basically collects all the logs.
But
now what it does is
feeds logs,
and it also gets feeds
CloudTrail.
from the CloudTrail, and then apply intelligence to what the agent is in and reconcile all that together to say, well, this is the visibility. And they're coming up with new tools, things like you can do your PCI DSS and all those checks on some of the workloads that you got. Now, it's not the detailed one, but it's basically uses all the various benchmarks, CIS benchmark, and categorizes a lot of things to say, well, your deployment is not accurate. And it's a bit expensive, but I think it gives a lot of, if you're new to cloud or you know the basics, but you don't know how the governance should work, Lacework is definitely a very good tool. It could be, it's very simple to use, but the polygraph is actually the winning thing, where it draws all the connectivities for you. You can download stuff and do more analysis. I think the just like Datadog, it does a lot of monitoring as well. It gives you all the various interaction within your workloads, your hosts, your Kubernetes clusters, and all that. You get all those metrics. But the cool thing is, once it notices users incorrectly logging in, it alerts you, and you can say, well, okay, we know this, so it applies that learning that, okay, if Ayse is logging in from different location at different times, then it applies that knowledge to say, well, okay, now we know the profile, and this is no longer a risk. So it's a cool tool. Yeah.
There was a tool that I can't remember, so I'll have to link to you guys, that you can actually turn on it, and it might be benchmarking, I don't recall, but after you actually had done the configuration, there was a tool in Amazon, in the AWS actually, that would allow you to verify where the fragilities are. I don't recall the name. I think it was like benchmarking, or it was running a set of controls and verifying like there was no two-factor authentication on the root account or something like this. Which one is it? I'm trying to find it, but I can't remember.
I think
there are quite a number of tools. Are you talking of?
To be honest, guys, I don't remember. What I remember, and I had a big list. So it's like we had configuration over infrastructure, and it was on Terraform.
Yes.
And
yes.
I thought that was a brilliant idea because we could
I know the tool
everywhere.
you're talking of. I know the tool. I've forgotten the name.
But I can't remember either. I'll have to get it.
I'll scan it for you. I'll try and get it.
Because I tried it. I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it. But my point was that we thought it was brilliant because we could move between cloud environments, but then we never actually did. So rather than going to the specifics of using everything that Amazon provided us, we didn't actually explore that. The thing was that I preferred still the infrastructure as code possibility, or ability, I should say, than actually using the point and click that they offer on their platform, just because it's closer to code. Maybe I'm just old, I don't know. But it just made me feel like
no, it's much better, man. Infrastructure is code every day.
Well,
so I think Ayse or Zach, you guys knew which tool he's talking about.
It's not Chekhov, is it?
Oh man,
no, Chekhov is for configuration. I know the tool he's talking of. I've used it, but I can't just remember the name. It integrates SteamPipe. Is it SteamPipe? Is that the one?
Let's put it on the side and have a separate discussion.
I think it's SteamPipe. I think it's SteamPipe because SteamPipe allows, goes in with a SteamPipe.
SQL to query the configuration.
It's SteamPipe. I think it's called SteamPipe. That's the one.
Right.
Let me get the URL. SteamPipe.
So the last topic that I wanted just to pick your brains on is basically, do you have examples? And the building is one already, right? Where you are able to successfully use the security tools that we use for business or development advantage. What I'm saying is that you had a natural adoption of basically the tools or the capability, not because of security, right? But because of either business and or engineering capabilities. And a good example is cost, right? Like you can argue that when you do good cost control, the first people that get very happy with you is the finance team, right? Because you start saying, why can't we shut off everything that is running from midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning, right? Why do we allow all these machines going, right? So I try to negotiate sometimes the cost cuttings that we find into our security budget, going, hey, I just saved this amount of money. Can we get some of that, right? As you know,
that's a good idea. We can get those budget.
Exactly, right. But I think it's a, you know, again, I know. Do you have some examples of scenarios where the security tools actually added a huge amount of business value, that they were almost implemented without any pushback because everybody really saw the benefit?
Yeah, so for one such thing is, if we are going for a tool for one single project, then obviously it's going to be waste. If the project is cost worthy, we can go for it. If not, we can try to look for any alternatives. That's one of the suggestions. If you are a big organization and you are willing to use the particular tool across different regions and across different people, then that would be fine, is from my point of view. Because for a single team, for a single resource, spending that much amount would be not that extent. It would not be good, is what I feel.
Mm-hmm.
I think another service that AWS has that's really important, and it looks like security, but actually is a lot more than it is security, is SSM.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's more of a culture change, it's more of a practice change, but security inherently comes with the adoption of it.
Absolutely. And for reference, like, you know, if everybody has used the things that you can use with SSM is you can add it to all the images, you can auto patch things, you can basically have a much wider control of how things get deployed in your environment, correct?
And you can automate easier as well.
Automation, yeah.
So it's like not even looking at security perspective, just resource manager perspective, and it brings in that. I don't know if it's the other way around of the question you had, Dinis, but I'm not sure. So basically, it natively brings that security side of it, and brings in the auditing that we would miss if it wasn't used in as well. So yeah, it's one of my favorite ones.
Cool.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. I'm a big fan of SSM. We used it when we did sort of like a lift and shift of all our instances into the cloud. We wanted to use it as a patching solution, and we already had a WSOS server, and we brought that up onto the cloud, and you know, we deployed maintenance windows for scanning instances, patching them, etc. But the biggest challenge I found with it was the role that needs to be attached to the instances, the SSM managed instance core role. So getting developers to actually attach that to already existing, attaching the policies to existing roles, or, you know, it was really challenging because I think at the time, Security Hub didn't have a rule, config rule, which is the instance managed by SSM, which I think it is now a rule, which is really good. So you can then target those instances, you know, and get developers to, you know, do
But
that.
now you can just add a role to it, wasn't it? Last time I used it, you just literally, if you have a particular role, you would automatically auto-enroll the machines into the particular SSM group, if I remember correctly.
I think if it was, you can have an auto remediation, so you can attach the role, the policy to a role, then that role to an instance. I think I've got that the right way around. But then if the instance has already had a
for running stuff is a bit different. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Exactly.
Cool. All right, guys, we are on the hour. Any final thoughts? Any lasting words of advice for, you know, teams that want to get into AWS security, properly, or not properly, sorry, but use it to the full extent?
My
Definitely
biggest
going-
advice would be,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, definitely going to try all the tools which were discussed over here. At least if I'm not going to try, at least going to explore the stuff first, because I'm happy to know that these many alternative tools and these are the features that tool that will perform. Yeah.
Cool.
Mhm.
I'll go around to Anna. Ayse, I'll just call everybody out. It's easier, right? Okay. Ayse, what's your final thoughts? Ayse,
So my
sorry, Ayse.
my biggest advice would be, like we spoke earlier, security professionals may feel like out of depth, may feel like they may not have all the knowledge and etc. etc. It's not impossible. There's always going to be things that we don't know, and we will just keep learning. So throw yourself at it. Definitely get started with AWS security services that are not for security, but they're security features that will help us as well. And don't be afraid of mixing up different services, different tools, because there's no one tool that will do everything you ask it to do, everything your organization will need. So definitely go with your requirements rather than what a third-party vendor or open source stipulates.
Zach?
So I think I'd say you can go a little trigger happy with enabling different security services and enabling logging and all that sort of stuff, but you can also rack up your bills pretty quickly. So make sure you you keep an eye on your costs. So yeah, that'd be my advice.
And to lower your costs, Zach, I would take the backups off the cloud as well if you can.
Yeah, definitely don't back up to the same AWS account that you run the main things, right? Like kind of. Ola, any final words?
Final words for me is if you know exactly what you want, then it becomes easy, because the security domain is very wide. You start from identity and authentication, to provisioning things. So keep it simple. Have a niche area that you want to concentrate on, and then build on those. And in terms of the vastness of AWS, I mean, it keeps spinning all sort of services, and it's difficult sometimes keeping up. But then it depends on the context of where you work and what are the requirements of that, of your environment. And once you stick to that, I think I keep it that simple. It becomes a bit easier to do. Cool. That would be my advice.
André?
No, just play with it, but on a sandbox, preferably don't keep an eye on the costs. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, and I guess my final comment is that you in this world you always have to keep learning. So look, if you just join in, don't worry, you are just 1 year behind the state of the art, right? So if you think like basically, anybody again who's doing AWS today, if you don't keep an eye on what AWS has just released in security functions, within a year you're going to be quite out of date, right? So again, it's like as I was saying, keep learning, because actually the pace is moving so fast that even if you just joined recently, there is huge amount of innovation coming up on the pipelines. So brilliant. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
everyone.